So with that, we're going to go ahead and begin. I'd like to start us off by acknowledging that this virtual presentation is taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, home to nearly 200 tribal nations. In particular, I'm speaking to you from Patwin land on the lower Sacramento River. We acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. We encourage you to learn which tribal nations are indigenous to the area where you are now living. One excellent source of that information is Native Land, and we'll try to drop a link to that into the chat for you to explore later. So we're here today to explore the topic of urban ecology and resilience with our very own Dr. Sabrina Drill. Dr. Drill is the Natural Resources Advisor for UC Cooperative Extension in Los Angeles and Ventura counties, and the former director of the California Naturalist Program. She is also a researcher with the new Urban Biodiversity Hub, an international nonprofit. Her current areas of research and extension include urban ecology, restoration of urban streams, climate change resilience, terrestrial and aquatic invasive species, fire ecology, and public participation in science. Throughout her extension career, she has worked to build capacity for community-based resource management and to substantively engage underrepresented communities in stewardship of their local watersheds and ecosystems. Dr. Drill has conducted research in Southern California, the Colorado River, Hudson River, and the East African Great Lakes. She's a former Fulbright Fellow, has worked with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, Harvard University, and the Council for Watershed Health. She holds a PhD in geography and an MS in biology from UCLA, and her BS in biology from Virginia Tech. The California Naturalist Program in particular is really deeply indebted to her leadership for a variety of reasons. She's provided our program, she's provided support to our program in a wide range of areas, especially in broadening participation from communities around the state, especially in Southern California. Her networking, both within UCANR and within the UC system, and even more broadly in the National Extension Network, has been instrumental. One could be easily forgiven for thinking that she's more than one person with all of these things that she's engaged in. And much of the benefit has redounded to our program. So I want to thank and welcome Sabrina Drill to today's CONES webinar and let her go ahead and begin with our topic of urban ecology and resilience. And Sabrina, if you can hear me.
I am here. Let me just get my screen share going. Ay. Sorry, everyone. I'm on a new computer today.
While she's getting that set, I see that Elliot has dropped in a few links into the chat if you want to explore those, and I will look for that link for our CONES archive so you can see that as well.
Great. Hi, everyone. Sorry for that. I was making last minute adjustments, actually. So I'm going to be talking to you about urban ecology and resilience. I'm going to give you some overviews and some definitions of some terms, and then talk to you a little bit about research that I do on the Los Angeles River. So urban ecology is the scientific study of the relationship between living organisms, including humans, and up until then, that's kind of just the definition of ecology. What makes urban ecology different is that we're doing it in urban areas. Urban areas are really interesting because changes to physical conditions in those areas, as well as cultural factors, create novel ecosystems as native species and introduced species and people interact. Come on, slide forward. So I want to define a few things there that I mentioned that might not be familiar to you. The first is urban. It might sound obvious, like it's kind of like, you know, we all know it when we see it, right? But there's really no single definition. There's a combination of population density, built infrastructure, and land use that go into whatever definition of urban a particular agency is going to use. So like the Census Bureau, uses cities, but also metropolitan statistical areas. Novel ecosystems are ecosystems that differ in composition and or function from present and past ecosystems. And this is a really important concept. What it's saying is that we're creating things both in terms of human activity and human development of land, but also in terms of things like changing the climate, where we're bringing elements of what had been sort of going along as other ecosystems, adapting and changing, on their own to changes in physical condition, but we're really heightening that and bringing things together that didn't used to be together. And a big piece of this is introduced species. So species that are brought to an area by human activity that can be intentional via, say, urban horticulture, or just agriculture and horticulture generally, or it can be unintentional, something that comes along through shipping or weed seeds that are carried to a new area, or diseases, virus, and things that sort of hitchhike along, and also things like more recent introductions, like several marine species and nearshore species were introduced into the US on the West Coast after the tsunami in Japan several years ago. So why is it important to protect urban ecosystems? Because it's really been an area that wasn't the focus of conservation for a very long time. And there's a lot of different answers to this, so I'm going to give you my answer, kind of. They play an important role in local, regional, and global biodiversity. And most people on the planet live in cities. We hold political influence over conservation. We deserve benefits of access to nature. And ecological degradation in urban areas can affect global health, wellness, and livelihoods. Another way to think about this, sort of by the numbers, urban socio-ecological systems connect human and ecological well-being, but they have an outsized impact. So cities may only cover 2% of the Earth's surface, but they're housing about half our population, and that number keeps going up and going up. And again, it goes back to what you define as urban and whether you have to be within city limits or those informal settlements around cities. And they're responsible for most of the consumption on this. And I just wanted to point out a paper that we just published looking at the relationship between global biodiversity targets set forth in the Convention on Biodiversity and local city conservation plans. So urban ecology, again, it's not some brand new thing that I made up, right? It's been a field of ecology that's really grown since the 70s and 80s. And it treats the city as a set of niches that support species and interactions, just like we treat other kinds of environments. And it can find it, but one of the things that's interesting about it is that it's very hard to just sort of sit in a biology department and be an urban ecologist. You need to work with folks in the sociology department and urban planning and water resources, right? It all kind of comes together. And this is true in rural areas as well, but it's heightened in urban areas, in these social, ecological, technological systems. I don't want to quite say traditionally, it's kind of a loaded term in some ways, but in a lot of ecology, habitat maps, this is a map from 2015, and it's got vegetation, where they go on in this report to look at ecosystems, where the wetlands are, but city is gray, right? And I, working in Los Angeles, have dealt with this time and time again, where people seem to be interested in conservation of the Santa Monica Mountains, the San Gabriel Mountains, the desert, these systems surrounding the city, but the city is just this gray blob that's all the same. On the other hand, you have maps of ecosystem maps that just ignore that a city is present and just talk about the historic vegetation or what vegetation zone you're in. So some of the issues that I'll talk just a little bit more about in urban ecology are protecting urban habitat and habitat connectivity across the wildland-urban interface, providing equitable access to nature and natural resources, using nature-based solutions and green infrastructure, and those are kind of the same thing. Europeans tend to use the term nature-based solutions. In the US, we tend to use green infrastructure, using both of those to fulfill ecosystem services and bringing nature and biodiversity into urban planning and sort of the whole human well-being planning field, whether it's housing or transportation or whatever. So protecting urban habitat, we can consider protecting urban habitat important because species rely on it. This is actually a picture on the left. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but there's a picture on the left here of a proposed and now funded, and they may be breaking ground already, on a wildlife bridge that's going to cross the 101 freeway to connect the Simi Hills and the Santa Monica Mountains in sort of the northwestern part of LA. And there's many species that'll benefit from this, but it was really the need for cougars, pumas, mountain lions, that was the word I was looking for, to have these large home ranges that really pushed connecting these areas. And then on the right is the picture of Matilaha Dam on the Ventura River. And this would connect upstream and downstream habitat. One of the species that could benefit from that would be steelhead trout, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Oh, sorry. Got a squirrely little thing here. So supporting urban habitat, what are some of the ways that we can do that? Picking up trash is an obvious one, but then less obvious, protecting from air and water and soil contamination. Managing invasive species, supporting pollinators and other beneficial insects and wildlife, and doing, using native species, native plants that native wildlife can use in landscaping within cities. So it's, instead of a gray blob, when you look at the city, you see these little patches of habitat throughout. And from the perspective of a butterfly or a scrub jay, maybe these are usable pieces of habitat. They don't think of it as just, oh, it's urban, so I shouldn't go there. I did want to give kind of a shout out to a group that I'm working with now, Nature-Based Solutions for Urban Resilience in the Anthropocene. There we're really studying how these nature-based solutions can help cities be more resilient to things like climate change and other kinds of perturbations. And I'll get more into that now. So in cities, nature-based solutions are really about incorporating ecosystem services into urban planning. And ecosystem services mean things like cleaning air and water, improving water quality through biofiltration as the water flows through, say, wetlands, attenuating floods, reducing urban heat islands, all of these kinds of things that we could potentially use structures for, but we can also use ecosystem function for. And we can use that to build climate resilience. But it's also important to realize that we can use nature to address human and public health kinds of issues as well, like reducing stress. And there's a bunch of papers coming out about how important access to nature was to reduce stress during pandemic restrictions. So I'll talk a little bit about urban forests, which is really not my field. I'm an aquatic person, but it's a really important area when we think about nature-based solutions. So if you think about having urban tree canopy, that can mitigate some of the temperature impacts that come about from living in these developed areas where there's a lot of concrete and a lot of reflective and absorbent surfaces, but not things that are absorbing actual light energy the way plants do. And we'll talk about this more in a minute, but I do want you to notice that we see a difference here in Los Angeles in the urban canopy between lower income areas and higher income areas. If you're familiar with Los Angeles, Boyle Heights and Brentwood are two kind of extremes when we think about that. Urban forests are also important. Again, they connect people and nature, and I talked about that a little bit already. They provide wildlife habitat, and they can provide ecosystem services in terms of just straight out human resources, food, right? So there's a lot of energy now behind putting in urban orchards, for example, in cities. Water. Nature-based solutions are really important for this. So we think about both sort of water quality and water quantity. So stormwater management, a lot of times in California, where we're really kind of defined by drought, or at least in the southern part of the state where I work, we think about areas where we can collect water, contain it, and infiltrate it so that we can use underground water kind of as a reserve when it's not raining, because frequently it's not. In doing that, it improves the water quality. But in a lot of areas where floods are a really big issue, you can also look at sort of larger scale projects, not just the parking lot or the background level or the backyard level, to really absorb floodplains absorb floodwaters. And this is, what you might look at along the Mississippi River in the New Orleans area. And wetlands are particularly important. I'm not going to go through all of the features that make them important in this slide, but I did want to point out that they're really important in California because they help preserve our beach ecosystems. And whether you like the beach, whether you have strong feelings about, a moral obligation to help out species, that's all great. But when it comes down to dollars, tourism is a huge industry in California. And without healthy ecosystems, a lot of that nature-based tourism is what's driving people. They want to come to beaches, they want to come to mountains, and they want to have those kinds of high quality experiences. And then I'll talk a little bit about providing access to nature. Just a time check here. All right. It's important to provide equitable access to nature. And again, I try to kind of veer away from moral reasons. I may believe that this is an important thing to do because I just think it's an important thing to do. But it's also important because inequity can lead to instability. And that is something, this country has experienced a lot of instability around race in the last, its entire history. I don't even need to say in the last whatever. And providing access to nature is something that can really support socio-emotional well-being. And and we can discuss this later, but I believe should be a right of all people. Without equity in resource management, and I mean actually in the field of resource management, we're also losing a huge resource in that there's whole groups of people and whole groups of ideas that we don't have access to when we really limit both access to nature and access to nature-based economic pursuits. And I'll just give you an example that this is not sort of just feel good or maybe feel bad stuff. There are scientific studies. Chris Schell, hopefully he'll be invited to do a future cones. That would be excellent since he just joined the faculty at UC Berkeley. But he and this team published an article in Science about the ecological and evolutionary consequences of systemic racism in urban areas. And what they find is that because redlining has concentrated populations, but also concentrated environmental amenities, when you have things sort of written into the code or written into policy that restrict where different kinds of people can live, that actually ends up affecting where wildlife can live and really shortening or decreasing the diversity in urban food webs. Well, when we talk about providing equitable access to nature, I think it's important to realize there's a lot of elements to that, right? So there's recreation. And I think, one of the things that I think access to recreation is important, and it's something that is being discussed in California a lot, but there's often value judgments placed on it as to what kind of recreation is appropriate and what kind isn't, and those decisions are culturally determined. Certainly for Indigenous people, It's an important piece of their culture to have access to natural resources. Again, equitable access to ecosystem services is important for, protecting everyone. I've talked about the benefits for physical and mental and socio-emotional health. And then, as we, I think, shift a lot of our economic systems to try to really incorporate climate change, a lot of employment opportunities are going to be happening in green industries. And so making sure that there's access to that for people from a diversity of communities is going to be important. Okay, and lastly, I'm going to talk about resilience. I think I just have one slide. I really cut back a bunch of slides right before this talk from a longer presentation I gave. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about what resilience means, and whole books have been written on this, so I'm really simplifying things here. But it really comes down to the ability to continue to function after perturbation. I also, a friend of mine, I had posted something about the difference between sustainability and resilience, and she's a earthquake researcher, and she was just like, oh, I don't want to talk about it anymore, because again, books and books and books have been written about it. But essentially, sustainability is really kind of about keeping things the same in some ways, getting to a point where the resources and methods we use to take action and to use them are abundant and renewable and have, ideally net zero or even a positive feedback on the environment in which we use them. But really, it's about sustaining the same system. And there are great things about that. But I think it's important to realize that not everything else is going to stay the same, right? Resilience is really about change, about being able to respond to change in a way that makes ourselves, our communities, and our environments equally or even more able to respond to change in the future. If any of you are ready for a downer that really talks about climate change and some of the impacts, and maybe you can balance it out with some of the positive stories that I know we talk about a lot in Climate Stewards, read Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. Right. So in urban systems, where, kind of the vision would be for cities of the future that are resilient by virtue of their flexible, adaptable, equitable, and ecologically based infrastructure. And we know there's going to be an increasing incidence of extreme events, and the severity of those events is going to increase. So we really, change is a coming, and we can try to stem it, or we can try to embrace it and figure out what we can do with it. One of the areas where people are really looking, I talked a little bit about nature-based solutions, but if we think about this in terms of disaster risk reduction, we're thinking about things like restoring floodplains so that they can provide water storage and peak flow reduction that they did before they were, say, channelized or altered or diverted or dammed. Erosion and sediment control, having a drought buffer through water scarcity periods because there's the aquifers are recharged, reducing, maybe reducing heat waves. That's sort of another issue, getting into mitigation and adaptation, but certainly reducing the negative impacts of heat waves. And I'm not going to go through and talk about all of these, but kind of get the idea. And again, I know I'm sort of banging this in, but it's about embracing uncertainty because it's really difficult to predict a single future scenario with climate change. And in fact, I think that's where a lot of our climate change communication in the past has gotten hung up, because we have all these different models saying all these different things. Point being, we know change is coming, and we're going to need to incorporate multiple potential impacts and benefits. And in urban areas, that becomes even more vital because we just simply don't have space. We need each square foot, each square mile of land to do multiple things. That just has to happen in urban areas. Some of the things that can increase resilience are communication and collaboration, sharing data and engaging people in data, in collecting data and understanding their systems. Redundancy, where more than one piece of a system can address a perturbation. And ideally self-maintaining infrastructure, that's sort of the infrastructure, that's sort of the Ark of the Covenant, I guess, in nature-based solutions. Nothing is going to be maintenance free, but you may be able to greatly reduce maintenance costs. Okay, I don't know if you guys want me to take any questions now. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and maybe just put them in the chat, and I'll try to give you a 12-minute or so run through of the research I do in the LA River. So kind of pushing two talks together here. So for several years, I have been examining aquatic habitat in the Los Angeles River with the goal of informing a variety of different kinds of restoration activities. So the LA River, its upper watershed is in I don't want to say pristine, that's definitely a comparative thing, a judgment call, but it's in a protected area in Angeles National Forest. It's been highly modified by dams and certainly a great degree of channelization, but there are areas where there is a natural bottom in a couple of spots in Los Angeles. It's slated for, and I think this number is pretty old, that $2 billion restoration project, I think, has gone way up as we think about all of the different pieces of it. But the idea is to restore connectivity and urban parkland and ecosystem function. Although I should say the negative side is that, like a lot of urban riverfront development or just sort of urban revitalization efforts, it's driving a real estate boom, leading to a great deal of gentrification and just kind of amplifying the housing crisis that we see in Los Angeles and throughout the state. Oh, just some pictures of it. There's sort of the upper watershed in Angeles Forest. Here's some of the giant dams that you can see. So this whole area is behind Sepulveda Dam, and then some of the channels that have been installed really as flood protection to allow development to go right up to the banks of the river. So just thinking about Los Angeles as that's sort of a little bit on the ecological or hydrological side of things in terms of population. There's about 4 million people in the official city of Los Angeles, but there's at least 10 to 14 million in what you would think of as the city of Los Angeles. And it's actually really dense. So the Pico Rivera section of Los Angeles is denser than, say, Brooklyn or a lot of areas in New York City. There's a lot of different ways to think about ethnic diversity. So I'm just going to grab one indicator here. There are 224 languages spoken in Los Angeles, although Spanish and English do dominate. And there actually is a lot of open space in LA. We like to say there isn't, but we have these big swaths of federal land. We have a national park in the Santa Monica Mountains on the west side and a national forest on the northeast side. And actually also a national monument and a whole bunch of things going on, but we're still really park poor. So there's only 86 acres of natural space per 1,000 residents. But that number goes way down as it sort of on a scale as income goes down, park access goes down. So how do you decide what habitat should be there? Well, you can certainly look at historic condition. It's a Mediterranean climate zone, so that tells you a little bit about what kinds of, say, plants should be there and what kinds of precipitation regimes we can expect. Naturally, it has incredibly high sediment loads because the San Gabriel Mountains are still active orogeny. They're actively growing, they're actively uplifting, they're relatively young, and so there's a lot of erosion still occurring. And it's really, it's an area that is marked by disturbance. California as a whole is marked by disturbance. It's one of the things that drives such high biodiversity in the state is that we have floods and fires and all of these things. And so the Los Angeles basin where the city is just a giant alluvial basin. It's all built up because of this erosion that's happening from the mountains. So it's relatively flat and it's arid. Arid streams tend not to establish a stable channel like you would think about when you think about, the Hudson or the Thames or the Danube or something. So you got a flat area you got a stream that sometimes is running really high and sometimes is almost non-existent, or intermittent is what we'd call that. And that means that its channel has been all over the basin. So developing in the Los Angeles basin is a real challenge when it comes to that. So we've got those sort of physical realities there. And then with this big population, we have human needs for water storage, for provision of high quality water, for recreation, and a whole bunch, for commercial needs and industry. And there's a whole story to tell there. This slide kind of tells a little bit more of that story, but we know there were wetlands and springs throughout this whole basin. And we also know that native fish are adapted to these flashy, arid streams. So it's actually the idea of, Pacific salmonids, salmon, including steelhead trout that swim upstream to spawn. One of the issues is they don't need the whole river to be contiguous all the time. They only need there to be access between cool, established mountain streams and the ocean when they're actually needing to use that process. So let me talk a little bit more about that. I can tell you, sometimes the same thing just won't work. Okay. Oh, this is kind of in the wrong place. Sorry, I was talking about sort of alteration in the LA River and talking about how really the entire basin would have been a huge river delta, but certainly, these wetlands complexes that were at the mouth of both the Los Angeles and the San Gabriel rivers, that's all been changed into port now. And as you go upstream, you see areas that have been changed to, from a river to a storm drain because of all of this flooding, because the stream would flop back and forth all over this alluvial plain. And then you see dams to protect downstream areas from sediment, but also to store water. So, the past, this is already in sort of a channelized condition through downtown Los Angeles, but it's still an alluvial braided channel. The present, it's completely channelized. And the idea for the future is, can we bring back some ecosystem function, and can we bring back some connection for neighboring communities? So just talking a little bit about steelhead again, because they're really interesting species to think about in terms of using the entire watershed. But this really goes for a lot of species, right? We think about their habitat in one way, but different life history stages may have really different ecological needs. So spawning adults, they need access to spawning areas, which means, means the same thing as what eggs need, basically. High oxygen, cool water, and clean gravel where they can construct these redds, where they can lay the eggs, they can have a little bit of protection, but still access to a lot of oxygen. Then juveniles need to have deep enough and cool enough areas where they can survive over the summer. And then smolts, these are the sort of just pre-adults who will be going out to the ocean to mature fully in the ocean. They need access to the ocean, and they also need a functioning estuary system. Again, some broad strokes here. We could talk about, in more detail about any of those things if people have questions. So let's think about a steelhead in the Los Angeles River. So the first thing it's going to encounter is when you combine the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach together, essentially the largest port in the world. Then you have miles and miles of channelized stream. Then you get to these areas that I talked about where they're channelized on the sides, but there's actually something that looks like a river on the bottom. And these exist because they're areas where the groundwater table is so high because of underlying geology that they really couldn't channelize them. They couldn't channelize the bottom. They didn't have the technology to dewater sufficiently to do that. More fully channelized areas until you bang your head on a dam. And if you could get past that dam, that's the Devil's Gate Dam on the Arroyo Seco in Pasadena, you'd actually get to some pretty nice spawning habitat until you reach the natural upper limit of anadromy. So thinking about the LA River, my colleague Jason Post and I have been developing a study that should be published in February. It's actually a book chapter in a Routledge guide to sustainable cities on in the Pacific Rim. We asked, can river redevelopment in the LA area support biodiversity, natural resources, and avoid gentrification? And I'll be talking more about biodiversity and natural resources and kind of the difference there. So the theoretical framework that we sort of stole from was from a geographer who used to be at USC, Jennifer Wolch, and she developed a framework thinking about needing to be just green enough, that if you make things too good and too green, you actually get into economic conflicts because wealthier people want to live there and they can pay high enough prices to displace the people who are living there. And you might even get to the point where you have endangered species living there that then restrict what you can do legally, and there's some legal ways around that, but you kind of want to hit that sweet spot where you've got ecosystem function, but you're not completely going upside down with social function in the area too. So we asked, can urban river restoration be just blue enough to enhance biodiversity, balanced with ecosystem and cultural services in a way that does not drive gentrification? And I'll go through this in a little bit, but some of the elements that we needed to think about are the need for flood protection, the need for LA to become more independent in terms of water use, passive recreation, which is an active recreation, which are some of the ways we think about people accessing the river. And one element that Jason is really an expert on that has not been well incorporated into revitalization plans for the river, which is the fact that it's a functioning food fishery. So we conducted fish surveys over several years to actually find out what species are there now in the river. And I just wanted to give a shout out that we actually engaged a lot of community volunteers in this, both through events where we brought volunteers out on specific fishing days, or we held fishing derbies to just have people come and catch what they could, and through the use of iNaturalist, and just having people submit their own observations. And what we found is that there's 18 taxa that we can consistently find in the river. Out of those, 14 are non-native. 3 are estuarine natives. So in the main stem of the LA River, we found 1 freshwater native. And 5,600 is the number of fish we caught overall. So if you didn't think there were going to be fish in the LA River, this is good news, right? There's a large population of fish and they look relatively healthy. We don't see a lot of tumors, a lot of other signs of either disease or contaminated water or genetic malformation or something like that. But there's really few native species. And one of the reasons is that the predominantly warm, well, one of the reasons is changes in temperature. Let me just skip over to that right now. So we went back out to put together a temperature profile of the Los Angeles River and see where the water was really, really elevated. And then what we did, skip over that, is we compared the temperatures we saw with the maximum temperature requirements for native species. And not going into too much detail, here's Omicus, that's the steelhead trout. Here's a native Gasterosteus, native sucker, the 3-spine stickleback, and then a native and some native minnows in here. And what we're finding is, temperatures are elevated and they're really, in many areas, they're at least for some periods of time well above what these species can withstand. Now, I make a big point of this because we have a lot of plans to clean up water in the LA River, to bring back floodplains, to make these restored wetlands and things, but dealing with temperature, that I really think is going to be the greatest challenge to any of this work, if the goal is to bring native species back. Now, that's a real question. I do want to point out that fishing on the Los Angeles River, it may be ill-advised to eat fish from the LA River, although actually we had a very small sample size, but we sent in samples and they were not above limits for consuming fish. But for a long time, fishing on the LA River was considered illegal. However, how that was actually enacted had a lot to do with how wealthy you looked, because a lot of people are fishing in the LA River. Sorry, I'm going to go ahead to this slide. They're fishing there for a lot of reasons. So on the one hand, we had Orvis taking people out and doing casting lessons on the LA River, because if you look forward, especially like in this middle picture, you look forward, and if you don't know that a lot of those plants are invasive, it kind of looks like a river, right? But when you cast back, there's nothing to get hung up in. It's all concrete. It's kind of a perfect place to do that. We had that all the way to people who just like to go out to the river to spend the day with their family, to people who are really fishing for food. And what we find is most of the people who are fishing for food in the LA River, or at least a lot of them, and it's been hard to do this research, so I don't want to say this is definitive, are homeless. And we have massive homeless populations in the LA River and throughout California. And they are really using these resources directly as a source of food, and specifically as a source of protein. So before we go into questions on either parts of the talk, that was sort of my last slide that had a lot of information I was trying to send you. I just want to talk about some of the ways that naturalists can get involved in urban ecology or in urban conservation. So everything from, helping interpret urban ecosystems for communities, leading nature hikes, or volunteering at an urban natural history museum or nature center. Engaging in environmental and climate planning activities, so like going to all those public meetings and kind of making your voice heard there about what you want to see and what you value as a naturalist or as a climate steward. You can participate in or help coordinate on the ground things like cleanups or tree plantings, going out and doing an energy or a climate risk community audit, or a transportation audit to see if there's ways that we can reduce emissions by just reducing car use. You can educate folks about green infrastructure, maybe get involved in installing a demonstration rain garden or other kinds of stormwater best management practices. Foster participation in science. And I know, Greg, there's other chances you've had to discuss this, but really to promote environmental equity and justice as well. And I see a direct link between that and sort of the engaging with some of this planning. Do what you can to connect with members of unheard communities. Maybe it's, joining a Facebook group for a neighborhood or something, and then share information about opportunities to have input. Or if your local government is planning some kind of, way to collect information before a project, and you have a voice there, maybe you can say, hey, could we do this on a Saturday? Could we do it in an evening? Could we have childcare available so that parents who don't have other options can attend? Can we make sure there's virtual ways for people to participate and that they can do so in the language in which they're comfortable? So there's more ideas, but I'm ready to go on to Q&A if you like.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Sabrina. I'm going to go ahead. There are several questions in the chat, and I want to go ahead and get to those quickly, and then we'll have time for some additional questions. The first question is from Lori. Lori asks about what are some of the approaches or ways that you go about increasing equitable access to nature?
So one of the things that you can do is think about whether parks are being planned in the areas where they're needed. So who's going to use those parks? If you're, say, a park planning committee, I talked mostly about sort of thinking about kind of racial and economic justice, but, make sure there's no stairs, make sure there's a ramp, make sure it's equitable to folks with disabilities, or there's interpretation materials that are appropriate for people with visual impairments. But also, I think just kind of normalizing people of color being in nature. There's some really funny videos of Blair Underwood stars in one, if you guys remember him, where people are hiking in LA and people are, you know, if you're Black, people are staring at you. Get involved, invite, you know, follow Black Birders Week on Twitter and get engaged with some Black birders and invite them to an event that you're doing, those kinds of things. So some of them are structural, some of them are more process oriented. Thanks, Amy, just dropped Outdoor Afro in there. That group, Latino Outdoors, Asian Pacific Outdoors. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of groups you can get involved with. Wish Toyo Foundation, for those of you in Southern California, who works on access for Chumash populations. Yeah. Okay, and I'm not going to read the chat. So
I'm going to go ahead and just go through because I want to get through these in the order they came in. There was a couple of comments and questions about using native species for urban reforestation. I thought you might want to comment on that.
Sure. So there's a lot that goes into deciding what tree to plant where. And when we think about reforestation in Los Angeles, I think there tend to be two different kinds of venues. The first is in areas that have burned, whether we should go back there and plant the same trees that were there again, or whether we really need to think about the fact that, and I shouldn't say the fact that, people might argue with me, but that, you know, precipitation has changed. And maybe the species that was there is not a species that can be supported by the climate anymore. I'm totally in support of using native species where possible in urban areas and in urban forestry, but again, it depends on the species. You know, there's a lot that goes into that. So are the soil resources there? Do you have the space? Do you have the water? Now, a lot of native species are drought tolerant. Some are, some aren't. It's really hard to just say native's good, everything else bad. It's really got to be kind of the right tree in the right place. And if supporting native wildlife is one of your values, often you're going to fall onto native species for that.
Thanks, Sabrina. There was another question about how you go about recruiting and engaging community members to get involved. And I think you touched a little bit on that already. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think just being aware of barriers to access. And I really think, you know, people think about language right away, but I think maybe this is just my own struggles being a parent. I don't know, but, you know, think about a family where you have one or two income earners who are working like all the time, and then you're asking them to go to something, you better provide childcare as well. So just thinking about those kinds of things that can reduce barriers.
And I would just add,
and spending time in the community and not kind of imposing your values of what should be there, but listening to what community members want.
Yeah, I would just add to that, and Sabrina supported this early on, is the idea that now we are partnering with organizations that have the pulse of the communities that they serve. Community Nature Connection is a good example. And so it's not us necessarily doing something for them. It's now within our community, organizations that are addressing these issues internally. So I think it's something we really want to continue to advance. There was a quick question about green roofs and whether they could play a significant role in benefiting urban ecology. Any thoughts on that, Sabrina?
Yeah, I think they can, but you do need to kind of look at it from a landscape perspective. Now, I would say roofs are like this incredibly underutilized resource we have in California. And it goes back to just thinking city gray, no value for ecosystem services, right? So we have all these roofs that aren't doing anything. And some of them can be green roofs. Some of them could support food gardens. And a lot of them could support renewable energy production. So I don't think everything should be a green roof. I think you need kind of a mix of different things going on, but green roofs are great where they're appropriate.
Okay. One other question. How do we cool the water Is most of it reclaimed from the treatment plants? But I guess maybe the main question there is, how can we cool those water temperatures?
It's okay. So the first thing is we've lost most of our riparian canopy cover. So simple shading, right, is something that we've lost when we channelize these rivers. We just have a lot more sunlight hitting that water. The other thing is we put in concrete. And I have been done, like, I'm not going to start another career as an engineer anytime soon, but I've been trying to talk to more like materials kinds of folks to understand the thermal balance in concrete. But it's storing that energy and releasing it at night. So those are physical things. And with, unlimited funds, you could address those, right? And you could cool water as it's put out from treatment plants, because yes, the LA River is, depending on the time of year, anywhere from 95 to 80% outflow from water treatment plants. However, air temperatures have risen, so there's only so much we're going to be able to accomplish, even if we had unlimited funds. And even if we addressed all of those things at a local level, we need to be aware of the fact that water temperatures across the world are increasing because air temperatures are increasing.
There was another comment about whether or not we could manage or control the temperature of water discharges as you might control other pollutants. So I don't know if you have anything to share on that.
Yeah, I see somebody posting about that. This is certainly something that power plants have some experience dealing with. It's actually funny. So in the San Gabriel River, towards the mouth of the San Gabriel River, there is a power plant, and the outflows have elevated water temperature there, and they've had some legal issues, and they've tried to, cool the water. You can certainly cool the water. You can refrigerate it. That takes a lot of energy. Electricity, carbon output, all of that. What's really neat there, just a little side story, is that it's actually supporting a population of green sea turtles. So we have sea turtles that swim up the San Gabriel River and hang out in these waters that are tropical temperatures. So yeah, you could do it, but again, it's all going to be about what resources do you have to invest there, both in terms of money and in terms of things like energy, and is that renewable energy?
Margie asked a question. Did you read the piece on the LA River in this morning's LA Times? Any thoughts to share? Don't know if you saw that.
I'm sorry, I didn't. So,
and if you all want to turn your camera on at this point, that's fine. We'd love to see your faces. There's several comments and thoughts and suggestions and ideas. There's another question here from Natasha. I've heard that the San Gabriel and LA rivers both pass through highly contaminated areas, sometimes right by Superfund sites. Do you know much about whether there is any proposals to look into this issue of possible contamination?
Yes. Short answer, yes. So I don't know how familiar you are with sort of water quality regulation in California, but so this is kind of interesting because it's sort of arcane, and I think a lot of bad things happen in this country because they're shrouded in a lot of words and a lot of bureaucracy, right? You're getting my political bent a little bit here, but so waters of the United States have to reach certain water quality standards based on what we call beneficial uses. And the beneficial uses can be habitat, they can be recreation, they can be actually using it as potable water, right? So all of these areas are held to that legally if the Los Angeles River is the water of the United States. Now, it wasn't until, oh my gosh, I'm going to date myself here, but I think I hope it was the early 2000s, because otherwise I'm going to feel really old. So for various reasons, the Army Corps of Engineers has the authority to determine what is a water of the United States, because it has to both be usable, and it has to be navigable. And if it's not navigable water, it is not protected under our water quality laws. I hope I'm not going down too much of a rabbit hole here, but it's important for people to be aware of this stuff. So that was really in question, whether the LA River was a water of the United States. And one of the things that pushed the Army Corps a bit was a group of rogue kayakers who went down the LA River to prove that you could navigate it. And there aren't really good standards in that law for what navigable means. So and a lot of the stuff has been done through like executive orders too, which are really hard to keep track of because they're not bills that, go through Congress and stuff. So I'm sorry, I don't know the year. If anybody can look it up, that would be great. But the EPA finally came in and said, we don't care what you have to say anymore, Army Corps, we're declaring it a navigable water. So it is subject to these water quality protections. Now, that doesn't mean it meets them, but it does mean that people get fined a heck of a lot of money when it doesn't meet them. And so yes, there are a lot of contaminant issues, and there's a lot of work around trying to clean up those contaminant issues. But again, I go back to, as bad as those are, they're easier than temperature.
Okay, Sabrina, we need to start to wrap up. I want to thank you personally for joining us today and sharing your thoughts about urban ecology and resilience. I did want to wrap up and make sure that everybody knows that there is an evaluation link in the chat. We really appreciate your feedback. We've gotten tremendous feedback from the previous CONES webinars. It's very helpful for us to make sure that we're providing you with topics and presenters and delivery methods that you enjoy and want to see more of. So I want to thank Sabrina before we wrap up.
Greg, can I put a quick pitch in for something too?
Very quick.
We're wrapping up, and that is for the CalNet stories. I'm actually trying to do some research on the impacts that CalNet has had, the longer term impacts than just that, what you fill out at the end of your course. And a great way to report those would be to submit a CalNet story. And I'm sure Elliot can follow up with how to do that.
We'll try to put the link in the chat as well. I want to just thank everybody for joining, thank our speaker for sharing with us today. I want everybody to pencil in, if you're ready to meet in person, go beyond these Zoom chats and webinars and meetings. Pencil in the 2022 statewide conference at Lake Tahoe at Tahoe City, October 7th through 9th. We are going to have a tremendous program for everybody, so we want to see you there. So put that on your calendar. More information will be available online, and we'll get registration up hopefully soon. The other thing that I wanted to say is that if you get a chance and can share not only your stories, but also want to share any experiences that you as a naturalist or a steward is doing already in the area of urban ecology and resilience, please go ahead and send us a note. We'd love to hear more from you on that. So again, thank you to Sabrina, and thank you to all of you for joining us. We'll see you next month on the next CONES. Bye-bye now.